Hello everyone. Today I will be presenting on the topic of humanitarian issues in remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia and the role of education in addressing these issues. This issue is deeply connected to human rights and social justice because education is not only a basic right but also a foundation for empowerment, self-determination and community well-being. However, for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children growing up in remote regions, their right to education is compromised by a range of structural, cultural and systematic barriers. In this presentation, I will cover four main parts: a review of the literature to outline the key issues and challenges in the context, a theoretical framing of the issue using post-colonial theory and critical curriculum perspectives, an exploration of relevant organizations and strategies that support educators working with Indigenous communities, practical recommendations for future educators that can be applied in professional practice. Now, let's begin with the main issues facing the Indigenous communities. The disadvantages faced by the remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are not just random disadvantages, but are the outcome of systematic oppression rooted in Australia's colonial history. Unequal power relations persist today as governments and educational institutions continue to control the structures of schooling with limited input from Indigenous communities themselves. This long history of colonialization and systematic racism and oppression has led to Indigenous communities being neglected. From a human rights perspective, this is very concerning. Children's rights to education, as recognized in Article 28 of the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, cannot be realized in remote areas unless broader inequalities are addressed. Education does not occur in isolation. The right to education is inseparably linked with other rights: the right to health, the right to cultural identity, and the right to be protected from any abuse. Any strategy aimed at improving educational outcomes for these children must therefore be holistic and must recognize these interconnections. Another issue is the way mainstream schooling often fails to reflect the cultural and linguistic traditions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Language and customs are vital to identity and belonging, but many schools in remote areas operate exclusively within a Western framework. As a result, many students may feel alienated from their own cultural heritage while also disengaging from a curriculum that does not reflect who they are. Preserving Indigenous languages and cultural practices through education is therefore a human right. It's a human right issue in itself, as it ensures that children do not lose touch with their identities. Remoteness is also a major barrier to consistent school access. Remote schools are structurally disadvantaged. They often receive less funding than mainstream schools and lack resources that are considered standard elsewhere. This has a direct effect on learning outcomes, particularly in literacy and numeracy, where remote Indigenous students consistently score lower than their non-Indigenous peers. There is also an ongoing debate about whether Indigenous students should be integrated in mainstream education systems in ways that effectively assimilate them, or whether education should instead focus on preserving and strengthening their culture. The current system tends to measure all students by the same national standards without acknowledging that Indigenous students are not receiving the same quality of education to begin with. They face lower attendance, higher dropout rates, and have few qualified teachers. Indigenous communities in remote areas are also disproportionately affected by poverty, domestic violence, child protection involvement, as well as face severe mental health challenges. However, few limited mental health services are available to help the youth of Indigenous communities. Without helping them overcome these challenges, we cannot particularly help them achieve this right of education, as they lead to dropout rates and children leaving schools. All this creates a cycle of disadvantage that leads to under-resourced schools, which in turn leads to poor outcomes, which then places further pressure on already over-restricted departments of education. Rather than investing in the new system, they often focusing on managing the problem instead of solving it at its roots. Rather than helping students have a proper system, they often put money in trial and error methods in order to assimilate them effectively in society. Finally, education and community partnerships are crucial. In urban areas, strong links between schools, families, and communities are common. But in remote areas, these partnerships are often weak or absent. Without such collaboration, education cannot be truly responsive to local needs. This literature highlights that Indigenous children in remote communities face not only educational challenges but also broader humanitarian issues. There are human rights concerns, and addressing them requires an integrated, culturally respectful, and holistic approach. Now we are going to look at how social theory and critical pedagogical theories can help explain these inequalities. And in particular, we are going to discuss the post-colonial theory and the critical pedagogy by Paulo Freire. To critically understand these challenges, I will use post-colonial theory as outlined by Vanessa Andreotti in her book Actionable Post-Colonial Theory in Education, and also draw on Chapter 10 of Understanding Curriculum, the Australian Context, which focuses on Indigenous issues and social justices. I will also be drawing insights from the critical pedagogy by Paulo Freire. Post-colonial theory helps us see how the legacies of colonization continue to shape education in Australia today. Schooling systems were historically used as tools of colonization designed to assimilate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children into Western culture while erasing their own languages, traditions, and worldviews. Andreotti argues that education is not neutral. The current structures of remote schooling still carry Eurocentric assumptions about what counts as knowledge, what success looks like, and whose voices are valued. Indigenous knowledge systems are often sidelined or ignored, reinforcing structural inequalities. Chapter 10 of Understanding Curriculum highlights that mainstream curriculum often erases Indigenous contributions or presents them as marginal. This creates what is known as a deficit discourse, where Indigenous learners are seen as lacking compared to non Indigenous students, rather than recognizing how the system itself is structured against them. From this perspective, the humanitarian issues facing remote Indigenous communities are not just random disadvantages, but are the outcomes of systematic oppression rooted in Australia's colonial history. Unequal power relations persist today as governments and educational institutions continue to control the structure of schooling with limited input from Australian Indigenous communities themselves. To address these injustices, critical pedagogy provides a useful approach. Paulo Freire argued that education should be a practice of freedom, not domination. This means empowering learners to question, resist, and transform oppressive systems. For Indigenous communities, critical pedagogy would involve making education more participatory, more dialogical, and more culturally grounded. It requires listening to Indigenous voices and treating them as equal partners in designing education. In short, post colonial theory reveals that the humanitarian issues we see today are rooted in colonial structures that persist in education, while critical pedagogy offers pathways to resist and reimagine education as a tool for liberation rather than assimilation. These images highlight the central idea of the post-colonial lens and the critical pedagogy lens by Paulo Freire and Vanessa Andreotti. They believe that education should not be a tool and a system to further impose the colonialist ideology. Rather, they should be a tool to help indigenous communities realize their strengths and help them as a community to uprise against these humanitarian issues that they're currently facing and help their community cherish and achieve socio-economic benefits. So what is being done about these issues? Several organizations and NGOs are actively working to support the indigenous education and well-being. And now we will be looking at a few of such organizations that are working to support education of remote Australian indigenous communities. First, SNAICC, National Voice for Our Children. The Secretariat of National Aboriginal and Islander Childcare, or SNICC, advocates for the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. It provides resources for educators and policymakers on culturally safe education and child development. Next, we have the Children's Ground. Children's Ground is an innovative organization that develops community-driven education models. Their approach integrates culture, language, health, and well-being, showing how holistic strategies can create meaningful and sustainable change. Next, we have the Lowitja Institute. This is a national research organization focused on indigenous health. Their work highlights the links between health and education, emphasizing that children cannot succeed in school unless their broader health and well-being needs are met. Then, last but not the least, we have the Reconciliation Australia. Reconciliation Australia works with schools and organizations to promote reconciliation through reconciliation action plans. These provide structured ways for schools to build stronger partnerships with indigenous communities and integrate cultural perspectives into education. Now, based on our research, we will be looking at some recommendations that educators can apply in classrooms and schools to in order to overcome these humanitarian issues and to make education accessible for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. First, we can strengthen the school community relationship, something that we often see in the urban environment but is rarely present or almost absent in the remote communities. As the values of the school system or the classroom teaching does not mostly align with the goals and future aspirations of remote indigenous communities. Hence, educators need to work directly with local elders, parents, and community members to plan lessons that include indigenous histories, languages, and cultural practices. They need to use local stories, land-based learning, and of course, community knowledge as part of classroom content. It matters as this decolonizes the curriculum by centering indigenous voices, it strengthens student identity, belonging, and engagement, and it aligns with post-colonial theory and critical pedagogy, which advocates for learning that challenge colonial hierarchies of knowledge. We need to make sure that the curriculum aligns with their history and their interests, and it is taught in a way that enables them to become better communicators and have a dialogical approach with their educators. Next, we need to implement trauma-informed and holistic education practices. We need to create safe, predictable classroom environments that recognize the effects of historical and intergenerational trauma. We need to integrate well-being programs and collaborate with local health services. And we need to prioritize relationship building before academic outcomes. It matters as trauma affects concentration, attendance, and self-regulation. Holistic, culturally responsive approaches help meet children's right to health and education simultaneously. It supports the whole child rather than viewing learning problems as individual defects. Next, we need to build long-term community partnerships from ongoing collaboration between schools, local organizations like Children's Grounds or SNICC, and as well as families. We need to establish community advisory groups or cultural layers or roles within schools. It matters as it moves from tokenistic consultation to genuine partnership. It promotes trust and shared decision making, addressing structural inequities that post colonial theory highlights. It makes education more relevant and sustainable for remote communities. Last but not the least, we need to advocate for equity and professional learning. We need to push for equitable funding and staffing in remote schools. We need to participate in continuous professional learning on decolonizing education, cultural competency, and critical pedagogy. We need to encourage colleagues to reflect critically on how Eurocentric assumptions shape their teaching. It matters as systematic change requires both advocacy and educator growth. It ensures teachers don't unintentionally reproduce colonial patterns in the classroom, and it builds a network of educators committed to justice oriented practice. In conclusion, the humanitarian issues facing remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia highlight the deep connections between education, human rights, and social justice. Remoteness, poverty, violence, health issues, and cultural marginalization all combine to create significant barriers to learning. Post-colonial theory helps us see how these barriers are rooted in Australia's colonial history, while critical pedagogy offers a way forward towards an education system that empowers rather than assimilates, that values Indigenous knowledge alongside Western knowledge, and that places community voices at the center. By learning from organizations such as SNICC, Children's Ground, and the Luvidja Institute, and by adopting holistic, culturally respectful, and justice oriented practices, educators can help transform education into a space of empowerment and healing. The task for all of us, future educators, is to recognize education not just as a technical process, but as a deeply human, political, and moral endeavor. One that can either reproduce inequality or become a powerful tool for liberation and justice. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.